All right. So, so today I'm going to talk to you about the fragile world we really live in. Uh, I think one of the best periods, uh, at least in contemporary global history, were the 2 decades after after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We experienced a new kind of a world in which there was no immediate threat of a nuclear war. There was no immediate threat of a major war. There were minor threats, some of them exaggerated by US foreign policy, especially on the issue of rogue nations. And others were emerging as a result of the collapse of the bipolar system, which is that some of the states which were held together began to fall apart, such as Yugoslavia, for example. And then we also saw the emergence of terrorism and extremism. But the but all of this was happening under the umbrella of an exploding global economy with the rise of what we now, well, at that time too, globalization, and and it led to many countries and many societies coming out of poverty, especially India and China. Between India and China, you could clearly argue that at least 1 billion people joined the global middle class. A lot of that has to do with uh, the globalization of the global economy. If there are questions about globalization, you can ask me towards the end of the lecture during the Q&A. But I want to move forward and say that after 9/11 and the big recession in 2008, we have seen certain trends, certain global trends, which have not only undermined the gains, or it depends on how you look at it, not only undermine the gains of globalization, but also expose the ills of globalization. Uh, and beyond that, it also exposed the fragility of the global systems. Uh, I need to, I think, go to slideshow for this. So the first thing that I want to talk about is that we are living in a period where all the institutions of world politics, especially institutions which build the structure of world politics, are decaying. So, what is decaying first? Uh, so, we obviously the most important element of the global system is states. They are the units which constitute the global system, and they are failing. Uh, there is an index called Fragile State Index, which I think you should look at it, and I'm sure your professor Isa will share it with you. I will talk about it extensively during this lecture, but you should also take a closer look at it. So, if after the emergence of states like Somalia and Afghanistan, which were essentially ill governed by their governments, and because there were civil wars inside these states, essentially states were failing at performing the most important function that states are expected to perform, which is to control their borders and monopolize violence between their borders. So, because these states were unable to control the violence within their borders, and they could also not control their borders, people increasingly started worrying about these states as early as the late 1990s. And there were reports out there which started talking about failed states, states which are unable to perform the function that states are supposed to. And they began to see failed states as a threat to global security. So when 9/11 happened, we traced the origin of 9/11 back to Afghanistan. And the reason why Al Qaeda was able to establish itself in Afghanistan and then perform major operations worldwide was partly because Afghanistan was, in the language of that time, a failed state. The Afghan government was unable to control what was going on within its borders. There were autonomous entities, which were not even Afghan, which were conducting operations out of their territory. So this idea that of failed states began to gain currency, not so much from the perspective of good governance or how to improve governance, but essentially from the perspective that there were security threats, particularly for the US, but also for European states. But of course, academic debates began to happen, and so we started asking questions. When do we qualify a state as a failed state? I mean, like, how many things have to fall apart because then we can classify a state as a state. Look at what's happening in the United States today. We are clearly one of the worst countries when it comes to responding to COVID-19, probably the worst response globally. Uh, and we have violence all over the country right now. The police is brutally killing its own citizens. Citizens are burning down the country. And so you could argue that the United States looks like a failed state at the moment, the world's most strongest state with the world's biggest economy is not performing as a state should be. So the question started asking as to what it ultimately led to was not that we did identify many indicators, and I will talk about what those indicators are in a short while. However, rather than talking about failed state, we started talking about failing states and then moved on to talk about them as fragile states. So essentially what has happened is uh, because we were not able to actually identify the tipping point beyond which a country can be called as a failed state, we basically made the whole world fragile. And so we developed an index which measures the fragility of states. And so there is the most fragile state and the least fragile state. So in a way, we are indirectly measuring the robustness of a nation. To step back a little and remind ourselves as to what essentially are the functions of a state, the United Nations requires that countries be able to govern their population, to have an accepted border in the sense that you have a border which other states also recognize. You have a fixed population in that border. You should be able to govern it, and you should be able to conduct international relations. If these are the four functions that you can perform, then the United Nations deems you as a potential member, and you can become a country. So in that way, what the United Nations has also done by articulating what the qualifying membership requirements are, it is also in a way defined what a state has to do. So essentially, it's have a population, have the capacity to govern that population and have a capacity to control its borders and also have the capacity to conduct international relations. So in many ways, what we are talking about is state capacity or the capacity of states to govern. So parallel to the fragile states literature, which is essentially focused on security threats, both internal and external, uh, what we also have is a parallel literature on good governance, which essentially also, well, we can say it directly talks about the fragility of states. The, the better governed you are, the less fragile you are. The worse governed you are, the more fragile you become. I tend to link the two because I'm more interested in good governance, and I perceive uh, failure of states as essentially failure of governance. So it is essentially bad governance which makes states fragile. The second thing is that we are now seeing the decline of what we call as the neoliberal we are into the post-globalization era. We are looking at the collapse or the decline of the neoliberal global order. The neoliberal global order was essentially a political economic understanding of how the world looked after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You had a unipolar moment. The United States was the world's biggest economy, now the world's sole superpower. It was able to dictate how it would run the global order. And the United States, remember, it was Bill Clinton who was president at that time in 1992 onwards till the end of the century. And his grand strategy was to promote democracy and promote free markets. He used the phrase enlargement. So he wanted to enlarge the global economy, and he wanted to enlarge the area where democracy was. And so you could see that from 1990s onwards till about 2005 and 6, there was a rapid growth in the number of countries that became democratic. Not only did we see an expansion of the democratic sphere in the world, but we also saw the expansion of the global market, which is essentially the heydays of globalization. World Economic Forum became important. More and more countries, especially from Asia, started becoming richer as a result of essentially a mass migration of manufacturing from the West to the East, uh, uh, essentially taking advantage of cheaper labor. So these economies of scale, which were driving globalization, which required the lowering of tariffs to promote trade, which also required the word liberalization itself meant that the barriers to international trade, international travel, movement of capital, movement of people, movement of information, all of that went down as a result of that, of what we call as a globalization phenomena. However, lately we are beginning to see that countries are raising tariffs. So the US and China are having a tariff fight right now. The US, India also are having issues because India continues to impose tariffs on US exports to India, while until recently India was enjoying exports to the US which were free from taxation. And then with the decline of manufacturing in the US to such an extent that it has created an employment problem in the US, which is partly one of the reasons why populist leaders like Donald Trump have got elected. Their response has been to either slow down globalization or erect barriers which will impede the growth of globalization. So not only the rhetoric of authoritarian rulers all over the world, whether it is Duterte, Donald Trump, or others, there has been a slowing down of globalization. Some of the institutions of globalization have become weaker. United States itself has withdrawn from international treaties which were part of the globalization and neoliberal order. So essentially, we are witnessing a decline in the neoliberal order. The reason why I'm emphasizing a neoliberal order is that while every order is a system in which you have units and then you have a structure and some organizing principles. These organizing principles are, are essentially an articulation of a philosophy or a normative position. So what we saw emerging from 1990s until 2006, and I'll tell you why I'm picking the year 2006, is that we saw that the philosophical values which were driving the rules and the regimes that were emerging at the global order were all privileging globalization, international transport. Globalization is essentially a rapid movement of things across borders. People, money, money was the first, money, people, goods, ideas. And meanwhile, we saw the emergence of technologies which made all of this happen faster. More air travel, uh, information technology like the internet and Facebook. Now we can make free phone calls all over the world using things like WhatsApp, Facebook. We can communicate through video phones. Ideas are shared worldwide. Money can be easily transferred. You could go to eBay today and buy a pen from a Chinese vendor for less than 50 cents, and it will be in your mailbox in 2 or 3 days. It's unthinkable. Uh, I bought something which was worth 40 cents and it was delivered by the mail. I don't know how it is even possible, but it did. So all of these things were consequences of globalization. But the negative side of the consequence of globalization was that while many countries actually reached middle income level, most prominently India and China, the world's two biggest and most populous countries. But many other countries, also Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, most of East Asia entered what we call as middle income states. So poverty shrunk globally, but it also resulted in creating inequities between the rich and poor within the countries. And that is one of the reasons why we see the rise of populism, because there is a population, a segment of the population in every country which feels that globalization has left them behind. And they find themselves completely unprepared for the globalized world. They don't have the skills, they don't have the resources to go and acquire new skills. And one of the things that globalization has also done is torn away at the welfare uh, state. Uh, that is and unnecessary consequences. It is essentially as a result of the globalization of greed, you could argue. The globalization of greed has essentially eroded the safety networks in many countries, and the lack of safety networks has increased inequity between the population. So the rich become very rich and poor are poor. It is so ridiculous that I have 5 degrees, and I've been working in the US for 20 years, and I worked 3 years in India. So more than 2 years, 2 decades of work. And I'm not a millionaire. And we are living in a world where we might, within a few years, see our first trillionaire. Can you imagine that? We're going to have a trillionaire. There's somebody who's going to be worth more than 1,000 billions. 1,000 billions. Can you imagine that? Before his divorce, Bezos was worth over $150 billion. His income probably is more than some countries. So we are living in a world where there is so much disparity. Half of America, the world's richest country, half of Americans have less than $1,000 in their bank, less than $400 for nearly 40% of the population. So at one end, you have people who have less than $400, one crisis, and they are ruined. And then, and this is in the world's richest country. I'm not talking about the poor people in the world. So this is one of the consequences of the neoliberal order, and the people are resisting it and pushing it back. So the philosophical foundations of the post Cold War order is beginning to decline, partly also because of the relative weakening of the United States, and under Donald Trump, the withdrawal of the United States from the international management. So, for example, look at how the US has responded to COVID. We're not even managing COVID at home. Forget about dealing with it worldwide. When we had the previous pandemic, uh, President Obama had sent teams of scientists and others all the way to Africa to stop it right there at the source. And we built a whole team of people to deal with these pandemics. But now, not only are we not dealing with ourselves, we have completely abandoned the world. We do nothing for the rest of the world on the COVID issue. We just told the world, well, you're on your own, buddy. Uh, in fact, I was having a conversation on, I think it was BBC, and one of my counterparts from one of the third world countries said, well, the way you guys are managing your own country, I'm glad you're not managing the rest of the world when it comes to COVID. So the world is now without U.S. leadership, and it was the U.S. leadership which was the primary sponsor, underwriter, and promoter of the neoliberal order. So we see that eventually it is also beginning to decide. What is not clear is what is going to replace the philosophical foundations of the emerging global order. What we do see is the rise of authoritarianism and the emergence of more and more fragile states. So you're going to have fragile states. You may not have a clear ideology or ideas which are underpinning the global order, and no major sponsor of whatever ideas are popular. The third thing is the decline of what some people call as the Anglo-Saxon hegemony. So Peter Katzenstein, a very important theorist of international relations, teaches at Cornell, has argued that when people say that we live in a world dominated by Western hegemony, it is incorrect. What we actually had experienced was the domination of English-speaking countries. So he said the world was not dominated by Germany. It was dominated by England, US, and its allies. So essentially he says that a coalition inside the West of English-speaking countries like Canada, the US, UK, Australia, and New Zealand have been dominant in shaping Western ideas of what is the West, Western values, etc. Europe and non-English speaking European countries tagged along. And so what we essentially saw was in the post-World War II area is an Anglo-Saxon hegemony. And as democracy becomes weaker in these countries, which is United Kingdom and the US, the two of the, that's 40% of the United States Security Council, the nuclear power states, and as these countries begin to become weaker, the Anglo-Saxon hegemony in the post-World War II era has declined. And now coming back to the Westphalian system. The Westphalian system is essentially a system of nation states where polities are defined literally in the context of borders. So the most important principle of the Westphalian system is the concept of sovereignty. Sovereignty has many definitions. One definition of sovereignty is the capacity of a political system to have constitutional autonomy. That means that it is able to shape its constitution in whichever way it wishes without interference from other countries overseas. But you could also argue that sovereignty is essentially the exclusive exercise of legitimate power over a fixed territory. So if you have a political entity in which you have a governing entity which exercises exclusive authority over its territory, then it is claimed to have sovereignty over the system. So based on this idea of a state which possesses a sovereignty. So sovereignty is both an internal and external recognition of exclusive authority. So we developed this system of states. Now what is happening is that that claim to sovereignty itself is becoming more and more hollow, partly because of globalization, and the emergence of the post Second World War rise of what we call as international society, international norms, international regimes, and many international organizations, international treaties. So we have a network of what we can call as a normative international system, which has rules and regulations and laws and practices and good practices, all of which have essentially taken away the autonomy of many states from doing whatever you like. So even if you're king of Saudi Arabia, there are things that you cannot do. You cannot kill your own citizen. Look what happened with the killing of the reporter Khashoggi by the Saudis in Turkey. I mean, Saudi Arabia has since then suffered kind of a pariah system. And if many of the nations were not dependent on their economic relations with Saudi Arabia and Saudi oil, I think Saudi Arabia would have been clearly labeled as a rogue state. uh, because of that one act, because it violated so many international norms. So, so in a way, the international order weakened the state systems by reducing the capacity of the states to govern itself. But there were many other advantages. It also strengthened your economy, strengthened your legitimacy. It was easier for smaller states to defend themselves because of the presence of a global order. You didn't have to spend so much money on your defense. We don't see countries invading other countries and swallowing states up as we used to in the past. But now, with the emergence of failed states and failing states, what we have is the challenge to the Westphalian system. So, if states are failing, then what kind of system is going to emerge? There is no clear indication of what that has happened. Not enough states have failed for us to say that the Westphalian system has collapsed. But we can definitely say that the Westphalian system today looks far more fragile than it did in 1995. Remember, I kept talking about the year 2016. So if you go to the democracy index, it's a measure of democracies in the world. We will notice that from 1990 to 2006, many countries became democratic. So there were more countries becoming democratic. Not only that, but countries which were democratic became more democratic in the sense there were more freedoms added. To give you an example, in the United States alone, we saw civil rights being extended to the LGBTQ community and so on and so forth. So you could argue that the US had become more democratic than it was before that particular shift took place in the society, culture, and the legal system. So countries which were already democratic were becoming more democratic, and countries which were not democratic were also transitioning towards democracy, primarily from Eastern Europe. Uh, However, after 2006, we tend to notice that both those trends have not only have completely reversed. So now we have fewer democracies in 2020 than we did in 2006 worldwide. Many countries which were classified as democracies in 2005 are not classified as democracies in 2019. Uh, Not only that, but countries which were democratic have become less democratic since 2006. Any guesses what the United States rank is on the democracy index? The world's the champion of global freedom, the leader of the free world. Well, the US is not, I think the US is not even in the top 25 democracies in the world. Countries like South Korea are now rated as more democratic. I think South Korea and Taiwan are both more democratic than the US. So there are countries which have become less democratic, uh, even countries that you would not think of. Uh, Even in the West, like UK in Western Europe, where they have become less democratic than they were in the past. So, I mean, the story that I'm trying to tell you is that everything that was institutionally uh, like the pillars of global order, all of those institutions are beginning to crumble and decay. So, we are living in a very fragile world. Any questions so far? Okay,
So,
go ahead.
I wanted to ask if you think the trend in the U.S. Pulling back from the neoliberal order, do
Mm-hmm.
you think that's unique to the Trump presidency, or is that a larger trend that was taking place before and would continue afterwards?
Well, the US has been slightly schizophrenic when it comes to the international order, right? So, for example, if you go all the way back to 1918, the League of Nations was created because of some of the ideas that were advanced by Woodrow Wilson, his 14 points. And and the United States did not join the League of Nations, and it collapsed. So the United States has had this tension in its foreign policy where it wants to do good worldwide, but it also wants to isolate. The founding fathers were isolationists in this country, and they didn't want to get involved in European politics. They wanted to stay away. They did not want to become what Britain had become, a kind of a balancer of power in Europe. So Britain had to constantly engage into every little fight that Europe was involved in. So the US has had a long streak of isolationist tendencies. However, after World War II, we had no choice. We kind of inherited the world. We became the world's dominant superpower, and we did a good job, I think, of building the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, the economic side of global management, the security side of it. The US became the prominent player in the world, and so the US was heavily globally engaged. And I think during the period of Bill Clinton, we were all out globalists. I mean, primarily, globalization is considered as a consensus between certain institutions, and all of those institutions are located in Washington, D.C. In fact, I don't know how many of you have taken the metro in Washington, D.C., but if someone asked you what is the address for globalization, then you would say, take the metro to Foggy Bottom. So at Foggy Bottom, which is right there in George Washington University, you can get down at Foggy Bottom, you can walk to the State Department, you can walk to the World Bank, you can walk to IMF, and you can walk to many other embassies right there. So it was a consensus between these institutions to promote certain norms and values which promoted the global order. However, the United States has the US would perceive that the international order then also started hurting US national interests. When we created the European United Nations, there were what 40, 50 countries, most of them Europeans and Western, completely aligned. And then after decolonization, you had 100 new countries come in who were not voting the way the US is. So the US has one vote in the General Assembly, and some Pidlu African country with less than, I don't know, with no resources would have one vote. It does not make sense to the US and saying, I'm giving 50, 60% of the UN budget, and they are offering nothing. In fact, they are takers from the UN, and we are givers. So there was all this perception. So there were, like the US Congress was always reluctant to fund the UN and were constantly opposed to US global. But on the presidential side of it, the US was heavily engaged. Uh, with the rise of Donald Trump, I don't know whether Donald Trump is really interested in governing anything. I don't think he's even interested in governing the United States. So, for example, 3 or 4 days after the George Floyd episode, if I was president, I would have gone to Minneapolis. I would have gone out there. I would have walked on those streets. I would have gone and met the family and tried to soothe the country, not divide the country further. The US withdrawal from some of the key institutions like the Climate Accord of Paris not only undermines those institutions but also essentially excludes. So US cut off funding to WHO, the World Health Organization. And now the World Health Organization is probably run more by China than anybody else. So by walking away in a huff and a puff from international institutions, they have become sufficiently stable as to not collapse and other people are going to emerge. So in a sense, we are abandoning our own leadership positions that we have developed. So it tends to happen a lot under Republicans. So for example, George Bush, when he was president, he also was against the International Court of Justice because International Court of Justice would then have prosecuted both Dick Cheney and George W. Bush for war crimes committed in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the US wants to help and create an international court which will prosecute everybody else in the world but not the US. So we have always tried to do that. And so in that sense, we try to promote an order and then try to get exceptions for us and maybe for Israel, and then we try to undermine those same institutions. And these are more because of divergent political tendencies within the United States. Okay, does that help you understand? But we have lost a lot of international prestige under Obama. We've become a laughing stock. People laugh about the United States and its leadership, undoubtedly. Uh, so this, what I have done here is these are actually two columns that I have taken from the fragile state index, and we can see that it's a very it's an intuitively inverse uh, index. So if you are number one on the index, it means you are the most fragile state in the world. You have either collapsed or you are about to collapse. So Yemen is the world's most fragile state at the moment. It is experiencing civil war. It is experiencing famine. Even if the civil war stops in Yemen, it is quite possible that a quarter of the population would die out of starvation, just out of starvation. So the country is suffering in many, many ways. It hasn't been governed at all for decades. It is tearing itself apart. Not only that, it has also become the battleground where regional powers are fighting proxy wars, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and its population is suffering. It has also become a base for Al Qaeda for a while, so terrorists are rampant. It is a country where weapons are easily available, and it was poor for a long time, and so there aren't any resources. Whatever state institutions existed were thin, and now with the collapse of order, those institutions don't function. So Yemen is one of the worst, or the worst, state when it comes to stability. And then you can see most of the in the same region: Somalia, South Sudan, Syria. Syria has experienced that 25% of Syrian population has run away, and so on. And the most stable country in the world is Finland. Most of the Scandinavian countries seem to be well governed, extremely stable, and they seem to enjoy peace and prosperity and welfare. So Finland, Norway, Switzerland, Denmark, Iceland, New Zealand, for example, if you notice, it has become completely COVID free. And the speed with which the Prime Minister of New Zealand was able to ban assault weapons and guns after the shooting in Christchurch, all of these indicate that the country is governed well, it is very stable, and so on. The United States, unfortunately, if you take 178 to 148, is ranked 29th in terms of stability. So there are 28 countries which are more stable than the United States in the world. And to me, it is amazing and perplexing that countries like Malta and Slovenia and Austria are more stable than the United States. Ireland, for a long time, was one of the poorest countries in Western Europe and plagued by terrorism and civil war, is now considered more stable than the United States, which is shocking. Uh, Let me share with you what these indexes are. So the way they measure it is they have classified that there are four types of indicators which are used. How am I doing on time, Isa? How much time do I have?
Lecture ends at 10:30.
Okay.
So we
Yeah, we have time. All right. So there are four elements or four types of indicators that the index looks at to measure fragility of states. And what it also does is has at least three components in each of those indicators. So I will start with this. So the most important one is about state cohesion, of how cohesive the society is. And it measures it on security apparatus, factionalized elites, and group grievances. So if you have a robust security apparatus, an army, a police force, etc., which are able to maintain order, protect your borders, handle terrorist threats, handle crime, then you are good to go. Consider this. Look at the crime in the United States has declined significantly, but right now we are experiencing protests all over the country which are protesting against our security apparatus. To a great extent, this call by some citizens to actually dissolve the police force essentially says that the population, or at least a segment of the population, has lost faith in the security system of the country. And that is amazing that we have lost faith in the security system. That weakens a state. And then you have elite who do not have an agreement between themselves. So imagine a country where the country is divided, where one party wants the country to go in this direction and another party wants to go in this direction. So the country tears itself apart. And that makes the country more fragile. However, if there is a consensus among the ruling elite and they are able to go in the same direction, then that country becomes more cohesive. So there are measures and surveys done which looks at various aspects of agreement and disagreement between the elite. Right now, if you look at it, forget about there being an agreement between Democrats and Republicans. There is no agreement within Democrats itself. Even if you look at the Bernie Sanders Democrats and you look at Joe Biden Democrats, they are going in the opposite direction. Joe Biden is like Bill Clinton. He's more into globalization and catering to a more free market side sort of setup, whereas Bernie Sanders is more towards regulations on the economy, more taxation, more welfare. He wants to rebuild the declining and eroding safety net in this country. So even the Democratic Party is become factionalized. On top of that, now we have this race issue where I can guarantee you that if Joe Biden does not nominate an African American as a vice presidential candidate, he will probably lose. He will lose the black vote. So there is a tension within the elite. And you can see this across the world. Wherever there are greater tensions and greater partisanship, those countries, A, are not governed well. It becomes very difficult to pass bills, very difficult to execute programs, but it also tends to, if it comes out on the streets, it makes the countries more stressed. And then group grievances. If you have groups based on race or religion or anything else which are being systematically marginalized either from the economy or their civil rights scenario is not in a good shape, they will be tempted to rebel, they will be tempted to take up arms, and so on and so forth. In India, you can see religious minorities being treated badly. It reduces the quality of democracy. If there is consistent violence, it also hurts the economy. And the presence of violence, absence of civil rights itself means that the country is less democratic and more fragile. So one set of values are these cohesion values. These are very, very important because if any of these criteria, like if the security apparatus becomes very weak, factionalized elites becomes very strong, group grievances becomes very strong, you will have a civil war in that country. The second one are economic indicators. Economic indicators are very clear. If you have a decline in your GDP, if your unemployment goes high, if there is disparity in income. So, for example, in the United States, the net worth of white households is on an average of $114,000 to $120,000. Net worth means you take all your assets and deduct all your liabilities. For example, in my case, take everything that I have in my retirement. Let's say I have $10 in my retirement. Take everything that I have in my bank. Let's say I have $5 in my bank. That's $15. And then take everything, all the books that you see, everything that I have, my cars, my watch, everything. Let's say $5 more. So I have $20. And then I owe the bank $5 for my house. I owe other banks $5 for my cars, etc. So I owe $10. I have $20. My net worth is $10. It's like that. So the net worth of white families in this country is about $114,000 to $120,000. Can you guess what the net worth of black families is? Any guesses? How many of you think it's more than $50,000? It is around $6,000. The net worth of black families is around $6,000. The net worth of white families is over $114,000. The disparity is so huge. So imagine who can survive a loss of a job because of COVID and so on. It's huge. So this aspect. So when economy declines, certain groups will suffer more, and that makes the country less stable. Clearly, if the country is poor and if the country is suffering recession, decline, if there is negative growth, all of this impacts the stability of the country, its ability to provide goods and services. Healthcare will suffer, education system will suffer, uh, etc. So, for example, uh, there was some violence in some state in California. I think there was a Hispanic kid who got killed, and none of the cops were wearing cameras because the county had not passed the bill and they had not paid for it. So even rich countries feel cash crunch and economic crunches. As a result of it, they are not able to provide services to their population. And then when these countries tend to become poorer and they're not able to take care of the population, then those who can run away. So for a lot of third world countries, brain drain has been a huge issue. Look at me. I'm an engineer with an MBA when I left India. So India lost an engineer to another country. Every year they lose 2 to 300,000 engineers who just go away, thousands of doctors. The United States has a deficit of 100,000 doctors. We need 100,000 more doctors and we are not able to produce them. And guess where we are going to get them from? From other countries. And those countries which are producing those doctors will lose. So all of this contributes to a country suffering. Uh, the third indicator is, let me just move, this is blocking, is political indicators. Political indicators is decline of state legitimacy can be a source of instability, can exacerbate the tensions between the elite, the tensions between the government and the population, etc. So there is an issue. There are countries where coups have been conducted, like take the case of Egypt, where the military is governing. It does not have any legitimacy. The elections were all fake. And as a result of that, the government itself cannot function. Yeah, they can remain in power using force, and it begins to be. So state legitimacy is really very important. Number two is the capacity of the government to provide public services. This is where good governance comes in. Good governance is essentially a measure of the delivery of public services. If the government cannot provide public goods, then it's not a good government. And of course, human rights and rule of law. It is a direct measurement of oppression. If there is oppression in the country, then it cannot. So, for example, India is going through a bad phase with regards to COVID. And reporters and journalists who are reporters and journalists who are criticizing the government for its mishandling of COVID are being put in prison. So these are further indications that already the democratic quality of the country has declined. And furthermore, that will lead to more abusive state, more repressive state. And finally, where is the? This is the fourth indicator, social indicator. This is an important indicator. It deals with the demographics of the population. Demographic pressures are an important issue. One of the reasons why immigration has become such a big issue in the United States is because of the changing nature of it. The US is used to be a very white country. Now it is maybe 65% white, with increase primarily of the Hispanic population. The Hispanic population is probably around 15% in the country today. African American is 12 to 13%. So between the two of them, they are more than a quarter of the country. And then with other foreigners, etc., I think the non-white population in the US has exceeded 30%. So as the white population decreases, you see all the kind of tensions and pressures that you are seeing right now. Make America Great Again is essentially a code word for Make America White Again. It triggers a lot of backlash against immigration, etc. Demographic pressures also increases the demand on social services for the government to provide, and the economy is not keeping pace with demographic growth, then the quality of governance begins to decline. And lately, refugees and internally displaced peoples, IDPs, have become a big, big issue. So, for example, look at New York. New York has suffered significantly because of COVID, and I'm very worried that a lot of people might decide to leave the city of New York and move down to Delaware, and that will increase the cost of housing, and so on and so forth, right? It may not necessarily be good. If they are very rich people and they're moving here, bringing money, that's fine. That will still impact the middle and lower middle classes, but they could add to the burden of the state's services. So, at a tiny level, internal displacements can be an issue, but on a large scale, if there is internal displacement, then it creates tensions, unemployment, and so on and so forth. In many parts of the countries, there are racial and ethnic differences, and so internal displacements then creates ethnic conflicts, etc. But international migration has also become a big issue, especially with refugees. Syrian refugees have Germany promised to take more than 1 million of that. A lot of experts believe that one of the reasons why Brexit happened, which means Britain left the European Union, is because of refugees and migration of people, Eastern Europeans coming to Britain, and a lot of potentially Middle Easterners coming to Britain because Europe was willing to take millions. Uh, in order for countries' economies to grow, the labor force has to grow. In order for the state to be able to provide services, it has to increase its tax base. And in order to increase tax base, it has to have more workers. So the economy will grow if the population grows. More people are buying more cars, more people are buying more phones. So you need a population growth. And so in Europe, population growth, the growth of the labor market, the growth of the economy is dependent essentially on international migration. So they do take refugees. In fact, Germany started by taking all the highly educated Syrians in first, engineers and doctors and scientists and people with technical skills who could immediately be deployed into the German economy. So countries need this. But however, with this migration comes social differences. People of different religions, different color. So if you bring in 20,000 Syrians into your small village to serve the factory, they will want a mosque and they'll want a school, and then their children will go around. And it changes the demographics of the country, and it puts pressure on social indicators, on social cohesion of that society. So these are the four primary measures on which the the index, the fragile state index, measures the fragility of states. I don't know which indicators are given greater weight and which indicators are given less weight. And but while while I agree with this, there are other issues also which I think can go into the historical aspects. Foreign intervention, especially external intervention, is other countries literally invading you or sanctioning you. One of the reasons why Iran is a less stable country is because of sanctions from, especially from the United States. So, so yes, foreign countries can put pressure on you and divert your resources. For a poor country to be involved in a war, which means it's spending more money in protecting its borders, and that means it's providing less services to its citizens, and that will make it a less stable, less robust country.
I have a question here,
Yeah,
Professor.
yeah, go ahead.
It seems that every indicator more or less seems related with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so let's think about Yemen, for example. You have mentioned about Yemen, the worst
Yeah,
fragile state and failed state right now.
yeah.
So if we want to save Yemen from its ashes, and if we want to save Yemen, and if we want to make it some kind of democratic country, where should we start? Where should we be?
Security is the first situation. You have to stop the fighting. You can't keep fighting and doing anything else, right? In order for you to, let us say that we have a bunch of Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, some Western countries come in and say, okay, we have a package of $50 billion that we would like to invest in Yemen, create an employment, build the infrastructure, rebuild the economy. A $50 billion influx into Yemen could solve a lot of its problems. However, you need to be able to stop the fighting first. So you rebuild the bridges in Sana'a, and the next day they blow it up. So what's the point? So you have to have uh, essentially security in the country, and that security will come from political settlement. So unless there is a political resolution to the conflict, there will be no security, and without any security, there will be no investment. Forget about foreign investment. Let's say there is some Yemenis, like you are a family of Yemeni guy, and suddenly in your backyard you discover a pot full of gold. Do you think you're going to invest that in your city? No, you will try to use that money to get out of Yemen. Try to invest it abroad or something like that. So even the Yemenis would not invest in Yemen at the moment, right? So this is an extreme case. I mean, the first solution will have to be a robust peace, and then we can begin to talk about. So the next step would be to stop the fighting, establish a government that is acceptable to others. Then we can talk with the government on economic development, etc. I mean, right now all people are doing is just sticking bandages to wounds, right? You're dealing with the demographic pressures, you're dealing with the refugees, you're trying to provide food, sometimes blanket, otherwise people will die in the winter. So you're just dealing with crisis at that level. But yes, they are obviously all interconnected, but some are critical. So you can find that there are countries like Yemen, which may be just as poor and economically weak, but are not experiencing civil wars. So they are more stable. They are more stable. So some of the countries which are rated higher than the United States are definitely they're not as strong economies as the US. They may not even be as strong democracies as the US, but they are more stable because there is no security problem, there is no factionalized elites, etc. Make sense? Okay. So the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about was to look at Finland and Yemen. So Finland was in 2006 rated, it was like here, 18th or something in this ranking, and it has come down to number one. So you can see that in less than 2 decades, in 15 years, it was able to become a more stable and robust country. And on the other hand, when you look at Yemen, in 2016, Yemen was in the middle, around 95, 96 out of 180 countries. And now it is 179. And this is primarily, you can actually find one cause for it, and that is the civil war. If the civil war ends, then Yemen comes right here. In spite of its poverty, in spite of its underdevelopment, in spite of its economic backwardness, Yemen will be a very stable country because it doesn't have other problems. It is pretty homogeneous when it comes to the population and so on and so forth. Look at the US. The US has declined significantly since 2006. So if you look at 2006, the US was ranked 128 out of roughly 170. So, and now it is ranked 149. So 21 countries have become more stable and more robust than the US in the last 15 years. If you notice, from 2006 to 2007, it dropped significantly. This is because of the recession and also the decline of the Patriot Act was passed, etc. This is all George W. Bush's second term. And then when Obama became president in 2009, it was ranked 159. And when he left in 2016, it was 159. So Obama's contribution is he didn't let the country become worse. He did not improve the US at all. It remained at 159. And then after Trump has become, it's dropped 10 more points in the last year. That means 9 more countries are now better governed and more stable than the United States is. Of course, it's all relative. You could be arguing that everybody is going down, but we are going down faster than more countries. So this is not at all a good trend for the. What's the point of having the world's strongest military and having the world's biggest economy if we cannot provide? What this ranking shows is that 148 countries are performing better than the US on all these indicators. That they have better human rights situation, they provide better services, their country has more state legitimacy, their security apparatus is better. Do you know that the United States government kills the police kills about 1,000 citizens in this country? In UK, they kill about 2 or 3 of their citizens. Like, what's the difference? Why? Do you know we have close to 3 million people in prison? We have more people in prison than there are countries with populations. So what kind of a country is this with people being killed by the police, being locked up, crime? There's something fundamentally wrong. So all of this, then income inequalities are so high. And we don't suffer from brain drain. We are the recipients and advantage. So yes, because we are a rich country, we have pockets. My fear is that we already do, but eventually we are going to have 2 clear Americas. One will be like a first world America with maybe, let's say by 2025, if the trends continue, we will have an America where you have a population of maybe 20, 30 million people with about 150,000 per capita, people who are making $150,000 and above. And they'll be enjoying wonderful living, great lives, great houses, great apartments, boats, shipping. And then you will have the rest of the population of 300 million people living on less than $30,000 a year with poverty, crime, drugs, opioid epidemics, suffering from police brutality, etc. So you might end up having two Americas. We already do. There are articles written about the top 10%, the new aristocracy. There's an article in the Atlantic about the new aristocracy in America. And I think they used a cutoff of $2 or $3 million net worth. So the top 10% of the population in this country. And I read that article very closely, and I would like to be part of that. There is stability, there is safety, there is security in that. I'm not there. And then the next 10% are more or less stable. Some of them will go down, some of them will go up. But then the bottom 80% is a very dangerous situation, very fragile. They live in a fragile state. So there will be part of America living in a robust United States, and there will be a majority of Americans living in a very fragile. It's like saying in the US borders, there will be some who will be living in Finland and some who will be living in Yemen. All right, so I'm going to stop at that. And if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer. Yes, go ahead.
James, please unmute yourself.
James, you're muted.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Where do you see, as of right now, where do you envision the future of like the United States like going forward as far as these particular issues?
See, the United States, fortunately, is a very well-endowed country. So, for example, US and China are of the same size. Did you know that? It's nearly exactly the same size physically. But we are 325 million, and they are exactly 1 billion more than us. So they have demographic pressures. We lost 40 million jobs during COVID, right? And so the government is under pressure to actually create 40 million more jobs. But imagine if you are China, you are under pressure to create 300 million more jobs, and so on and so forth. So the US is, in that sense, it's endowed. We have a large country. We have a very rich country from natural resources wise. Our security is safe because we have oceans on both sides of us. So there are no immediate threats from borders, etc. And there are certain cultural values in the country which are growth-oriented, hard work, willingness to work, sacrifice, etc., believe in material wealth, and therefore the desire to achieve that. And even the immigrants who are coming in are coming here primarily in pursuit of either the American dream or in pursuit of American freedoms because they're running from oppression. So their arrival also strengthens both sides of America, the political sides of it where they value democracy and freedoms, and the economic side of it because they value hard work and are chasing the American dream. So in that sense, we have the infrastructure to continue. We are going through, I think, an aberration, and if there is course correction, we need to do course correction soon. And if there is a course correction, then I think we will continue to dominate the next century. I don't think China is robust enough to replace us as a leader. What I don't know is the depth of our reservoir of... It's like saying that, imagine yourself as Michael Jordan, right, at the peak of your game. And then you take a long vacation for some reason and you stop going to the gym and you put on a little weight, a couple of 20 pounds, you develop a bad habit, maybe a little addiction on the side to marijuana, all of that, right? He could come back and in 1 month still be dunking and stuff, right? He could lose the weight very quickly. It depends on how robustly he tries to get back to it. But if he does that for 2 or 3 years, it doesn't matter whether you're Michael Jordan or LeBron, you're finished, right? So
Yeah.
the question really is, how long can the US continue with what it is doing to itself right now? How long can we just shoot ourselves in the foot before we reach that tipping point where it'll be very difficult for us to come back?
Yeah.
And dividing the country along racial lines, creating animosity, distrust. Now people are afraid to trust cops, and cops are afraid to trust other people. That's not a good thing at all. So this kind
Right.
of, if this begins to spread out, it weakens the society. There's less cooperation among the people. Our elite are so fundamentally divided. Every issue now is about attacking Trump or attacking Biden. We are not really, no one cares about what is good for America. They
Right.
only care
It's like
what is,
it's like very partisan in that sense.
yes. And to give you some bad news, your generation is probably going to be the first generation in the past few generations which will not do as well as their parents. That is settled. You will not have a better life than your parents. And that is scary, isn't it? Because if you,
I
if
I
you're,
honestly I think about it from time to time.
yeah.
It's yeah. It's
So what happens to your children then? How can you provide a better opportunities and a better platform for your children to take off when all your parents did was just, to give you an example, in the last 3 months, the government has spent $4 trillion to fight COVID. It's not free money. We are borrowing from the future. In the past, when the US did things like this, when they overspent, in the sense they didn't have a balanced budget, they did that to build the highway system, like the I-95s. They did that to build the Hoover Dam, you know. So what was happening was we were borrowing money from our next generation, but we were investing that in assets which generations afterwards benefited, right? So if I take money from your children to build a better highway or build a better electric system grid or something like that, there's nothing wrong with it. Your children will also benefit from that investment. However, if I take money from your children so that I can sit at home and eat good food in the next 4 months and not wear a mask and go to the beach and continue to, exacerbate this pandemic, then yeah, I may maintain a quality of life for myself today, but
right.
you are, and your children are going to pay for it. So that is an important aspect as to where where are we spending. Like the war on Iraq cost us $2 trillion, and
Right. Yeah.
has it made us better? No. Is it an investment in the future of America? No. So these are all imprudent governance policies, and if the government does not make prudent policies, then we might reach a point where it will become difficult for America to come back. But I don't know.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
can't tell you.
We can't really predict
Yes,
that.
I think that we can do it.
We can.
We can pull it around. Uh, we have an advantage over most other countries. We have the resources. We can deal with it. We can throw money at education. We can throw money at scientific development. We can throw money at healthcare and have a healthy and highly educated population and remain competitive globally. But people need to focus on doing that rather than partisanships and so on. All right. Any other questions?
I just had kind of like a personal question, sort of. So, do you think trade's a good way to increase relationships between countries or states?
Of course it is. Look at the tension between India and China right now at the border, right? They had a brawl. It was very funny. They fought with sticks with barbed wires on it. 20 people died on the Indian side. Some of them were thrown from the mountains. It's like one of those crazy kung fu movies, right, where they have a brawl in a bar kind of thing. But these two countries also have a trade of $100 billion. And if the tensions increase and the trade declines, then there will be many people unemployed on both sides of the country. Unemployment will reduce the country's GDPs, will reduce the country's capacity to invest in its own defense systems. So the trade, as long as it generates profits on both sides, is advantageous.
Okay. Do you think with like a state, do you think it will help that state like prosper a little more?
Yes, both sides. There has been, in the past, the US has used trade as an instrument of foreign policy to reward countries and to punish countries. So sometimes when we rewarded countries for political concessions that they made to us, we got into trade deals which were not advantageous for the US. However, if we were to make free trade deals which are advantageous to all countries, and that is economically kind of possible to some extent, some countries will benefit more than other countries, but the economies of scales and comparative advantage ideas in economies will tell us that that trade is definitely beneficial to everybody, as long as the trade is fair and as long as we do not indulge in policies which are designed to give advantage to certain corporations, which means there is no corruption in the countries on both sides. In the past, corruption is one of the reasons why some of the third world countries suffered a lot. But now you see even African countries are booming. African economies are growing very fast. They're becoming very attractive for investment. So yes, I think trade is beneficial. Uh, Look, ask yourself, how much of the stuff that you own comes from Walmart? And then walk through Walmart and see, I think 90% of the stuff in Walmart is from China. If we stop importing stuff from China, Chinese economy is going to go down. China will have millions, hundreds of millions of people without jobs, and definitely it will suffer. However, the cost of those things will just skyrocket. So for example, if I accidentally break a ironing board, I won't think twice. I'll just trash it, go get another one for $20. But if an ironing board costs me $250, do you think I will be able to do that? I may not have an ironing board to begin with, right? So the cost of many things that make our life easy has gone down because of the different cost of labor in different countries. Some people have labor advantage, some people have technology advantage, and so on and so forth. So yes, I do believe that trade, if managed well, is beneficial for all. Any other questions?
Thank you, Professor. It was wonderful for us.
Good. So I can go back to sleep now. All right. So take care, and I'll see you when I see you. Bye.
Thank you. I do.
Thank you.